have ever started to use a low-code application to start building out an automation only to get stuck with limited preset options when you go to manipulate the data, and then you end up giving up and scrapping the whole idea out of pure frustration? Then you'll be excited to hear about this new application I found called Kestra. Now, Kestra is a place where you can set up customizable workflows, but it has a code editor on the left and your workflow on the right, so you can see the code behind each connection. Now, this allows you to create more complex automations, like extracting product data from a PDF and then pulling it into a SQL database using BigQuery. We're gonna start out by going over the basics of Kestra, then we're gonna go into a full-blown example, the PDF to database example, kind of walk through that, and then finally execute that workflow and kind of show you some of the data analysis behind that as well. When you first log into Kestra, it's gonna look like this. I'm using the enterprise account, but they will roll this out as a cloud-based SaaS product, so where you pay monthly to use this service. And so on the left, you're gonna have these options, and this is how you're gonna navigate. This is very common. You see this in pretty much every automation tools. You'll have like a little panel on the left and then your main space here. So what you're gonna go do first is you're gonna go to namespaces. And the reason why they have namespaces is to separate like development versus production, or just think of it like a branch. So to kind of keep everything separate, or almost like a folder structure. So I just have one called Liz, but you could have one called Dev or anything. You need to click this create button, go to create, and you can name it. I just put Liz and then I put the description as Liz. It's not a big deal. You don't need to fill out any more of this. It's just, you know, as much as you want, and then save it. So that way you have your namespace, and that's important because when you go to use a template, you need to change that to the namespace that you want to save that to. Once you've done that, you can now go to blueprints. This is the same thing as templates, okay? It's the exact same thing. You can go through here, you can click and filter based on what you want to use. You know, if you want to use BigQuery, you can click that one and see some examples using that. But you're going to notice that these are going to be a lot more developer heavy than something like Zapier or Make.com. This is going to have way more customizable inputs. You can play around with it, you'll read the documentation. It's just a little bit more heavier on the developer side, but that makes it really unique because it's not these cookie cutter, super easy automations that never really work, to be completely honest. I've never had like one of those simple cookie cutter ones actually work out super well. So I like this. Scroll through here, see which ones you want to use. The best example that I'm going to be using here is an add-on. I added a couple more extra steps onto this one right here. So you can click in here and see what the automation looks like. They have the visual diagram, but the cool part, the best part about Kestra is the fact that they have the actual source code. So you have what's happening behind each connector. So they're not hiding that. You can change it, you can edit it, you can add more, you can read the documentation. It's just very easy to customize. When you want to go about using these, you actually press use once you find one that you like, and then you just need to change this namespace to the namespace that you just made. So I would change this to Liz, right? And then you are good to save it. You can save it and it will add it directly to your flows, and then you can access it from there. An important thing to know about how Kestra operates is essentially you're gonna have an ID, which is the name of your flow. So you can change this to anything. So you can change this not from parse_PDF. You can change it to another name. And you can't have the same name in the same namespace. So if you have two different, you can't have parse PDF twice in Liz. You have to change it. So I would use like parse PDF2 because I already have a parse_PDF. But that's just like a little thing to know. How it's set up is you have the ID, right? You can change it. It's just the name of your workflow. It's just whatever you want to name it. Namespace is going to be the namespace that you want to be in. Development, you want to be in production. Liz is my namespace. And then you have what are called tasks. And the tasks are what show up on here on the right-hand side. So each little piece of code corresponds to one of these nodes, right? So this is the code for this node. And then this is the code for this node or connection, right? This box, right? And then this last one is corresponding to this one. And you'll notice the name starts with the ID. So again, you can, anytime you see ID, you can change it to anything you want. So if you want to name this differently, you can just change the name and it will update it on your little node to the right. And then you're going to have type. And that is where the plugins come into play. And I'll show you exactly what the plugins look like, but essentially there are a list of different options that you can use in order to add a connection, right? So this, you'll have to read in the documentation. And I'll show you that in a little bit in the plugin section. The other cool part is if you just type it in. So if I just wanted to add, let's say I want to add another node, right? Just to give you an idea of like how this works, because it is new, you can just name this new task, right? Let's just call this new task. And then you're gonna do type, and let's say I wanted to use the Tika, right? So I would type in Tika, and then Tika, and then you can click, okay, I want to parse. Let's say I want to use the parse for the Tika. Click that, and then you have this new task, right? It named it new task. And then you can click this documentation, and then just click your task, and it will pull up the documentation live. So then you're like, oh yeah, perfect. This is what it says. Use this type, and that at least lets it know, oh, I'm using parse Tika. And then you have some examples, right? You need the from, you can do it extracted embed, that kind of stuff. And all this is in here. So if you wanted to have it as text, you can put, you know, content type and then colon text. So that's what we have here in this content type. I'm pulling it as text here. So that's a little bit about how it works. And then if you want to get rid of it, all you have to do is just remove it, right? Just delete, and then it will update your topology on the right here. So a little bit about documentation. We have the ability to click and then see the documentation. So if I click documentation and I click on this first task, you can see it changes to the documentation of download, right? Of this documentation. If I click here, it'll change it to the Tika parse documentation. If I click here, it'll change it to the log documentation. So it's updating. It's really nice because you can read through and see what kind of properties you have available to you and what outputs you can use, what inputs you can use, stuff like that. So that's really awesome. The other thing you can do is just go straight to the documentation on the left. So if I click this and then click plugins, and it's okay if I didn't save, because I'll show you the actual full example in a bit here. So if you look at this in plugins, you have a list of options, right? So we were looking at Apache Tika. Click here, here's your options as far as tasks go, and it's the exact same stuff. So you can kind of go into this plugin situation, look at it, and just know that if you type in Tika or just this exact line into your type field, then it will pull it up and add it as a connection. So that's really nice. That's just something to know about how to use it. And we'll go into more details once we get into the real live example. But that's how you should think about it, is you just have a series of tasks and each task is corresponded with a node. Another thing to note is you do have some core tasks. So if you come into here, you can see kind of these basic ones: pause, right? Parallel, flow, switch, you know, delete, split, that kind of stuff. So just know there are a bunch of core tasks in the plugins as well. Now that you got a feel for Kestra, I think it's important to just go into an example because that's the best way to learn. So what I'm trying to do here is I have a PDF of products, right? They sent me a spreadsheet in the form of a PDF. This is actually very common, even though they could just send you the Excel spreadsheet, but let's just say they didn't, because this happens all the time. They sent me this. I'm like, oh gosh, I gotta get this into a database, right? I could put it into Excel, but putting it into a database is just so much better because then you can pull from that database, you can query that database, you have that live, you can use it for whatever reason you want. You can even send it to an Excel spreadsheet. So it's better to have it kind of just automate all the way through into your database. So this is what we have here, and I want to send it into BigQuery SQL database. So that is the goal, is to pull the information out of here. Now, luckily, I just used the blueprint that we were just looking at. So I pulled that in, named it PDF to BigQuery, because that's what I'm doing. Added a couple more tasks to kind of complete that send off to BigQuery. So when you go in there, you click whatever your flow is that you want to use. I go straight to the editor. That is where I start, and then I put the topology on the right. So I look at it this way. So walking through, just to review, right? I have the ID, you can name it whatever you want. Namespace has to be the namespace that you put in your namespaces. It just has to match, so it's Liz, right? Then I have my tasks, right? So if we look here, I have ID download PDF. This, I'm just literally downloading that PDF. I give it the URL path, right? So if we go into the documentation and then I click this guy, it says downloads a file from HTTP server. Great. okay, here's your example, give it a URL, paste it in there, or URI, paste it in there, and then bam, you should have that. Now, the cool thing that you need to look out for is the outputs. So let's scroll down and you're gonna see outputs. I'm using the output URI. This, the URL of the downloaded file on Kestra's internal storage. Because if you want to use Tika in this documentation, it says that you need to have it as a internal storage. So that's what you'll read if you read through this documentation. So there's kind of some nuances here, but it's very easy to read. I mean, it's explaining, you know, you're gonna parse the document, right? So I'm storing it. Okay, now I'm gonna parse it, right? So I'm basically doing outputs dot download PDF, which is the name of my first task. So I'm taking basically the output of my first task, which is the download underscore PDF. And then I'm doing dot URI because that is the output of that task. How I found that dot URI is I went to the documentation of my first task, just like we just did, go to outputs and realize, okay, I have an output of URI. I'm gonna use that in my next step, my next task. So this is referencing, this line right here is referencing the output of your first task. That is kind of how it works. And you're gonna notice that as we continue down because the next task will reference the one before it. It's very sequential, it's easy to follow. Okay, so we download the PDF, we have parsed it, right? How I understood the content type, right, is because I went to the documentation and saw that there is a content type right here. And I picked text because I want the value to be text. So paste that in there. That's how you kind of know what to use and what you want to grab, right? So now we've parsed it, right? And now what is really cool is we actually made a wrapper around these guys here, right? So we're doing a working directory. Let me zoom in so you guys can see this. Working directory, right? And this is because I want to basically pull that text in, that text that we just parsed. I want to manipulate it using some Python, and then I want to paste it out as a CSV, and then I'm going to upload that to BigQuery. So that's kind of the overall feel for that. So you can see, again, you're going to go in here, read the documentation. This is going to be a working directory. Read the documentation, pull whatever you want. You got here outputs, parse.text, result, content. So I'm just pulling the content, right? And then I'm gonna use Python, do a little cleaning of it using pandas. So basically gonna read, you know, have the delimiter, you know, add all this stuff. You can read the documentation behind Python if you're not super familiar with Python. Don't overcomplicate it. It's right here. You can use this as an example. And then we're gonna have a CSV output. So then once you have that, you've gone through, you've cleaned it up, you have the CSV output, and now it's time to send it to BigQuery. So when you get to this step, this is the part where you need to connect Kestra to BigQuery and make sure that they can talk to each other. So if you haven't used BigQuery, it's super easy to use. It's basically somewhere where you can, you know, put SQL data sets online if you want to. It's free to use. Sign up. I just signed up for a free account, super easy. It said it wouldn't charge me for the free trial, so we love that. Basically, you're gonna go, I'll put the link in the description below, type in BigQuery, right? Click this. Then you're going to add a project if you don't have one. So you can click new project here and just name it whatever you want. I named mine Kestra Demo YouTube because we're doing a little demo for YouTube, so that's easy enough, right? And then what you're gonna do is you're actually gonna create a branch, right? So you can create a branch here, create data set. I'm just calling mine Liz, right? So it's a data set and I just called it Liz. And that's important because you're gonna use the name of your project in the Kestra code, and then you're also gonna use this Liz part in there as well. So let me show you. So if we go back to our code, right? I'm gonna have my destination or my project ID, right? You're gonna get that straight when you create the project. It'll tell you what your project ID is. Mine's just Kestra-demo-YouTube. And then your destination table, right? That's where the Liz comes in. And then you can name this in the code whatever you want. I just put products. You can name this whatever. You don't have to create, you know, another dropdown. It'll just create it itself. You just need this first part. You need the project name, and then you need the name of your data set. And then you're gonna have this project ID. And then the only other thing we need to do is make sure that you can pass in your secret or, you know, your key And how you're gonna go about doing that is you actually need to go to IAM, click this guy, and then you're going to go to service accounts, and then you're going to create a service account up here. You're gonna just do a basic editor is what I did. You'll see what I'm talking about when you click in there and create it. Once it's created, you'll click it and then go to keys and then add key, create new key, copy what it gives you in JSON. You'll see it is JSON, right? You'll copy it after you create the new key. You'll copy that whole thing. And then you'll go to Kestra here. You'll go into namespaces, click this little eyeball icon, go to secrets, click this edit and paste it in here, right here, the whole bracket everything, the whole JSON thing. And you can name it whatever you want and then put it in there. This name, remember that name, because what you're gonna do is you're actually gonna go back to your flows and you're gonna make sure you put that name down here, right? Because you need to pass in that key. So that's really how you get it to set up and attach to BigQuery. So overall, that was a lot to process, right? There's a lot happening there. You basically, if we look at the topology here, right? Let me zoom in a little bit. You're gonna download the PDF. You're gonna parse it, right? You're gonna pull out the text. Then you're gonna set up a working directory so that way you can use Python kind of to clean it up a little bit, right? So this is you setting up your working directory, pull in the text input, change it a little bit, play around with pandas, clean it up. I'll link my code below so you guys can kind of play around with it. And then send it out as a CSV, and then finally send it to BigQuery. So then we're gonna execute and I'll show you kind of what it looks like at the final stage, but just know this did not take that much time. All I did was go into the documentation, kind of look up, play around with it. Your logs are your best friends. So if you go to the logs, you can see when you have an issue, right? It'll tell you blah, 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 missing variable, and just kind of go through that and play around with it and then use the documentation on one screen as you play around with it. But again, I'll link all my stuff below so at least you have a working example. Okay, so when you are done and you are ready to run your execution, right? You're gonna click new execution. This thing's gonna pop up. You don't need a key or a value. That's optional. They're basically like tags, so when you can filter through your executions. So I just don't do it with one. Press execute, and then you'll see it running. It says success, which we love. And then you'll see it start running and showing, okay, there's it parsing. Okay, here it's got the working directory. Now it's doing some Python things, and you're just gonna have to wait until it continues. But what's cool is you can watch it kind of live, and then you have all these stats. So you can, streamline it or improve your coding in any way that you need to make it a little bit faster. Okay, so it has finalized. Now this took about 55 seconds, right? It tells you exactly, it tells you how many seconds per step, which is also nice because you can restructure things. So now what we're gonna do is go to our BigQuery and see if it actually did it. BigQuery, go here, and then we're gonna refresh. So if you click here, refresh contents, great. Go down here, click products, preview, and bam, we have the PDF content pulled into a SQL database, right? So this is great, it's in a SQL database. Now we can even look inside and see, okay, it looks exactly like what was in the PDF, which is great. So now you have something that you can literally pull stuff off a PDF and put it into a database. So now what we can also do is we can even look at the outputs and filter for CSV output and preview that. So there's lots of ways to see, to make sure if it worked, and if something's not right, you can always kind of look at what the output looks like, adjust from there if you're like, oh, I'm missing a line, or whatever, which is really nice because there's just a lot of options up here. You can go in the logs and see any errors, right? You can see your Gantt, you can see how long it took everything to process, all kinds of metrics if you want. You can display different types of metrics, anything you really want to see. And that's the cool part about this because it's very data focused. It's for developers. It's considered, I would say, more on the coding side rather than low code. But it allows you to have a bunch of customizable features. So it's worth learning some of the code behind this, and it's not that complicated. Now that you've seen a fully customizable version of automation software, it's worth looking at some of these ones that kind of wrap that out of it where they're considered more low code, something like Zappy or Make.com, which I both filmed videos on, and I'll link them up here and in the description, because that will give you an idea of like what I'm talking about when I say this Kestra is a little bit more developer heavy versus some of those other ones that just kind of wrap it and you don't ever see that code. So it really depends how complex your automations are, right? Because most of the time I go to make an automation and it's not as cookie cutter as they make it out to be. And so it's really nice to have this option to have Kestra where you can actually go in and edit the code and then look up documentation, look at the logs, see what failed, rather than kind of the low code heavy versions that are meant for people who are doing very simple automations. So feel free to check those videos out. I will link a bunch of other options in the description below. Otherwise, I will see you guys next time.